Hello there! Welcome back to my ongoing attempt to review every single game ever on Steam Deck. For those of you that didn't see my last video, where I took a look at every Manhunt game running on the deck, essentially the goal of this series is to showcase the unique capabilities of handheld gaming PCs. To do that, we're going to test every single version of every single Max Payne game on the Steam Deck. For those of you that are new to the series, here's how it works. Via emulation, I test every port of each game released across both console and PC and record footage of them via capture card. Based on my own subjective experience, I then give each port a compatibility score out of 10 and issue a final recommendation on which one you should play on Steam Deck. In order for a port to get top marks, it needs to run at its full intended frame rate and feature no major graphical issues. Additionally, each port needs to render at the deck's native resolution. I'll also be giving each game a little teensy review as we go along. It's like a bonus, yeah? It's worth mentioning that these videos take a lot of time to put together. With that in mind, I want them to be a service to you. If you like what I'm doing here, give the video a like and maybe even subscribe. If you have a particular franchise you'd like to see tested on deck, pause the video and let me know in the comments. Oh, and as always, I'll only be testing through SteamOS, as that's what the vast majority of users are rocking on their deck. Alright, on to the games. Okay, it's time for me to let you all in on a little secret. When I put these videos together, I typically don't play through the entirety of every game that I test. There's simply too many of them, and if I did sit with each game until completion, I'd never get a video done. With most titles, I will have beat the game at some point throughout my life. Remedy's Max Payne, however, is a blank spot for me. I've always been aware of Remedy and the Max Payne franchise, but I had never gotten fully immersed in this neo-noir gun-fu trilogy. Since beginning work on the video you're currently watching, I can safely say that I've remedied that gap in my library. Max Payne, along with its two sequels, have absolutely dug their claws into my brain in the bestest way possible. I've finished them all and I'm in love. The thing that stands out to me the most about the original Max Payne is its sheer ambition. It's easy to look back at its bullet time slow-mo, graphic novel cutscenes and surly introspective anti-hero as quaint and old-fashioned, but when I imagine games released in 2001, Max Payne is absolute dynamite in comparison to most of them. Small details like almost every object being interactive in some way, enemies talking to each other in the next room before you make your entrance, and the core mechanics of diving through the air and shooting dudes in slow-mo, it's all perfectly formed. When Max Payne released for the PS2, Xbox, PC and GBA in 2001, it reviewed incredibly well and sold in excess of 6 million copies. Max Payne is a triumph in game design, old school in all the right ways by today's standards, with edginess to match. It's so refreshing to play a game like this in 2023, especially when just about every major AAA release this year has been broken in one way or another. Max Payne is perfect in nearly every way. If modern games were built to the same standards as this one, our hobby would be in a much healthier state. Kicking off our testing for this episode, we're looking at the PS2 version of Max Payne running via PC SX2 within SteamOS 3.5. Now, I know I just spent the last few minutes singing the game's praises and, really gassing it up, but it's at this point that the positivity gets put on pause. You see, Max Payne's PS2 port is notoriously bad. It suffers from awful performance, it lacks the PC version's quick load and quick save features, and its texture quality took a significant hit, making the jump to PlayStation. With that said, Max Payne on the PS2 isn't entirely without merit. Its difficulty has been toned down to account for the lack of mouse and keyboard controls, which is welcome to say the least. As for how the port runs on Steam Deck, it's okay. Despite the deck's performance readout reporting a flawless 60 FPS output most of the time, the frame rate dips that were present on original PS2 hardware are still here within PC SX2. The game can really chug during firefights. This is when the port's egregious auto-aim assistance really saves the day. The absence of a quick load or quick save feature is essentially irrelevant thanks to save states, and whilst the PS2 version's visuals are a step below the game on other platforms, it still upscales pretty nicely to the deck's display. You could definitely argue that playing the PS2 version of Max Payne via emulation is equivalent to the act of polishing a turd. This is a bad port being emulated well on deck. For that reason, I'm going to mark this version down a couple of notches. There are better ways to play the game on deck that you'll soon see. The PS2 port of Max Payne scores a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10 on deck. Next up to the plate is the Xbox version of Max Payne running via xemu within SteamOS 3.5. As a port, the Xbox version of the game was a step above the PS2 iteration. Visually, it's a closer match for the PC port, and the ability to quick save is back, which is sure to alleviate some late game headaches. Emulating the game on deck, however, is a decidedly mixed bag. For starters, performance is all over the place. We get a double whammy of poor frame pacing and frame rate slowdown that is at best loosely tied to whatever happens on screen. This means that much like the PS2, firefights will stutter by with miserably slow performance. Visually, the game actually looks pretty good on deck. It's a nice middle ground between the PC version's pin-sharp textures and the PS2's softer overall composition. The biggest mark against this port is its instability when you try to emulate it on Valve's handheld. On more than one occasion, the emulator would crash during load screens, losing me a decent chunk of progress in the process. I'm hesitant to even hesitantly recommend Max Payne within xemu for this reason. Pretty visuals can't save this port from the chopping block. Max Payne's Xbox version gets a compatibility score of 4 out of 10 on deck. It's at this point in the episode that we reach our first incompatibility interlude. Rockstar put out a port of Max Payne for both iOS and Android in 2012, and to be fair, it isn't a bad way to play the game if you have a device with firmware that's old enough to run it. Can we emulate this version on Steam Deck, however? Well, no, we can't. As a result, Max Payne's mobile effort gets a compatibility rating of 0 out of 10 on Steam Deck. The final mainline version of Max Payne that we're taking a look at for this episode is the PC port, which is still available to purchase on Steam as of making this video. Sadly, Max Payne's PC version is one of those old-timey personal computer games. Basically, it's been left to rot in a pit of incompatibility. Out of the box, this game does not play nice on modern systems. Thankfully, Steam user Sloth has put together an excellent community guide on getting the game up and running on Steam Deck, which I will link in the description below. The entire process requires some careful faffing. However, if you follow each and every step the guide lays out, you will be up and running eventually without any issues. Once you get in-game, you'll be playing the best looking version of Max Payne by far. The game is pin sharp on deck, it's rendered at the appropriate resolution, and it zips by at a rock solid 60 frames per second. So it's a home run then, right? Well, not exactly. At its core, Max Payne is a computer game in the strictest sense of the word. The PC version of this game is absolutely intended to be played with a mouse and keyboard. Auto-aim assistance is incredibly mild compared to the home console ports of the game, so you'll need to get creative with the Steam Deck's myriad input methods in order to get the most out of the game. The footage you're seeing on screen is me playing the game with an external controller, and I am struggling. Playing on the deck itself, you can make use of the built-in gyro and touchpads to make things a little easier. It's just something to bear in mind. With that said, the end result is incredibly impressive on deck. Max Payne's razor-sharp visuals, high-fidelity audio and rock-solid performance are huge plus points. The drawn-out setup process, along with a reliance on gyro and touchpad controls, drag the game back from a perfect score. On balance, Max Payne's PC port gets a compatibility rating of 9 out of 10 on Steam Deck. 1 year after the release of Max Payne on PC, the game was ported over to Mac OS X by Westlake Interactive. Well done guys, great job. Can this version be played on the Steam Deck? Much like the iOS and Android ports, the answer is a resounding and thundering no. There are no supported emulators or compatibility layers for the deck that allow us to run this particular port of the game. The Mac OS X version of Max Payne scores an incredibly silly 0 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. Did you know that there was also a port of Max Payne released for the Game Boy Advance? Now you do. In 2003, Mobius Entertainment, who would later become Rockstar Leeds, put together an approximated isometric version of gaming's greatest revenge story for Nintendo's little handheld. Is it any good? Sure. The most impressive element of the game is that it actually retains a decent chunk of the original game's voice acting. Seriously, for the GBA, that's unheard of. Get it? The The core gameplay loop is incredibly similar to that of the console and PC versions too, along with enemy placements and even level layouts. We're running the game on deck via RetroArch's MGBA core within SteamOS 3.5. If you're using emudeck to install your emulators, you'll have the option to use either a standalone version of MGBA or the RetroArch core. I'd recommend the latter as it's much more performant on deck at this very moment. As you'd expect from a Game Boy Advance game running on an actual PC, the emulation here is perfect. This is a fun curio that I definitely recommend to any fan of the franchise. The visuals, audio and ambition featured in this port were impressive for the time, and all of these elements are conveyed well on deck. Max Payne's GBA port scores a compatibility rating of 10 out of 10 on Steam Deck. And that right there is every single port of Max Payne tested on Steam Deck. This incredible game is absolutely worth your attention, and the PC version is the way to go. It's a shame that Rockstar have allowed this game to wither away without true controller support or, well, even the ability to run on modern systems without fan patches, but here we are. As is the case with so many games, the community has stepped up to make the PC version of Max Payne a worthwhile experience on Steam Deck. Play it, or else. After the initial release of Max Payne, the rights to the franchise were bought up by Rockstar Games, who then entered into an agreement with Remedy that would see the studio develop a sequel. Just 18 months after Max Payne's initial release, Max Payne 2: The Fall of Max Payne was released for the PC, Xbox and PS2 in 2003. The sequel sees our sullen and ill-tempered anti-hero thrust into a love story of all things. Despite reviewing incredibly well, Max Payne 2 sold terribly, and I think it might have something to do with the fact that the game's original print run featured the subtitle "A Film Noir Love Story" on the box. Coming off the back of the hard-boiled, tongue-in-cheek vibe of the original game, this might have been a little heady for your average 2003 gamer. Prior to beginning work on this video, my familiarity with Max Payne 2 ended with its box art. However, I can safely say that it's now one of my favourite games, well, ever. It refines the original game's action sandbox into an endlessly rewarding loop of shoot man and watch him pirouette through physics objects. The game almost lulls you into a false sense of security, where it feels like Remedy's main focus was on gameplay. The narrative is obviously still there, but initially it feels somewhat secondary. As the game progresses, that film noir love story that the original box art touted blossoms into a multi-layered tale of self-acceptance and atonement. When the credits rolled on Max Payne 2, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, a hallmark of a good noir story. What I did know, however, was that I had just finished one of the best games of all time. The first port of this masterpiece we're taking a look at is the Xbox version, running via xemu within SteamOS 3.5. Those of you who've watched this series before will know that xemu is one of the weaker emulators on deck, owing to its relative youth and low level of accuracy. And look, that's putting it kindly. As for Max Payne 2, it's actually one of the stronger Xbox games we've tested on deck. However, I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's good. Visually, the game seems accurate to its source material, with no egregious glitches or standout problems that would mark the game down. Audio is mostly okay, although I did notice that the levels seem off. Certain sound effects like footsteps seem far louder than they should be, but only at seemingly random intervals. The real issue with this version is performance, which is absolutely all over the place on deck. The game runs with an uncapped frame rate, so if the emulator was refined enough and the deck powerful enough, we could theoretically hit 60 FPS. Instead, we hover anywhere between 30 and 50 most of the time. When the action gets intense, we see drops down as far as 20, so not the smoothest gaming experience on offer. Even though Max Payne 2's Xbox port isn't terrible on deck, it's far from a slam dunk. Pleasant visuals, gamepad optimizations like auto-aim, and a glitch-free experience all fall under the pros category, with the cons consisting of poor performance and wonky audio. Max Payne 2's Xbox port within xemu gets a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Switching gears, and we're looking toward the PS2 version of the game running via PCSX2 within SteamOS 3.5. I think we can safely say that the PlayStation 2 really got a raw deal when it came to the Max Payne series, and much like its predecessor, this port is absolutely stinking. Load times are long, the graphical quality pales in comparison to its Xbox and PC counterparts, there are far fewer physics objects in each level, and the game's audio is muffled and low bitrate. Despite all of this, the quality of the emulation on deck is actually quite good. Issues that plagued the game on original hardware, like the lack of a quick save feature and generally poor performance, are ironed out on deck. Much like Max Payne 1's PS2 port, however, emulation can only go so far. This port is notoriously terrible, and as a result, I'll be marking the game down based on the port itself as opposed to the emulation. That's a first for this series. Despite the fact that the PS2 version of Max Payne 2 was made to be played with a controller, and despite PCSX2's emulation improving on the original game, Max Payne 2's PS2 port is dragged down in compatibility via its point of origin. This version of the game scores a miserly compatibility rating of 5 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Last but certainly not least, we've got the PC version of the game, which, as of making this video, is available to purchase directly from Steam. Out of the box, this game does actually run on Steam Deck, which is a notable improvement over its predecessor. However, the game's resolution is stretched and skewed and definitely not widescreen. Steam user Darksha put together a guide on getting the original Max Payne up and running on modern systems, and within the FAQ for that guide, which I've linked below by the way, they've provided a link to a fix pack for Max Payne 2. Dropping the files from that pack into my Max Payne 2 folder got rid of any outstanding issues on my side, and the game looks phenomenal on deck once it's been configured. Performance-wise, Max Payne 2's PC port is locked at 60 FPS, and I didn't notice any dips that pulled me out of the experience. Audio is also good, levels are fine. The only real area I can criticise here are the game's controls, which lack any formal controller support whatsoever. Now of course, much like with Max Payne 1, this plays into the deck's strengths to a degree. Even if you don't want to configure a controller preset for the game yourself, there are a whole bunch of pre-made community layouts on Steam that will get you up and running. You're bound to have a good experience as a result, especially if you're willing to engage in some touchpad and gyro action. It would just be nice to not have to do that if you don't want to. Nitpicks aside, the PC version of Max Payne 2 is incredibly strong on deck, and it's easily the best port of the bunch. Given that we're running this version as close to natively as the deck will allow, every ounce of the game's physics-enabled, rainy noir atmosphere successfully makes the leap to Valve's handheld. Max Payne 2's PC port scores a compatibility rating of 9 out of 10 on deck. And after just 3 ports, that's your lot. Every single version of Max Payne 2 has been tested on deck. It would be nice if the PC version had the controller friendliness of the console ports, however, the game we're left with on deck, even without those creature comforts, is absolutely still worth playing. As I mentioned within this section's intro, Max Payne 2 is undoubtedly one of my new favourite games ever. If you have a Steam Deck, play the PC version of this game on it. I absolutely promise that you will not be disappointed. Rockstar Games weren't shy in letting the world know that Max Payne 2 had underperformed at retail and had vastly fallen short of their sales expectations. As a result, the publisher effectively put the franchise to bed, before miraculously reviving it for a third entry almost a decade later. Max Payne 3 was released in 2012 for the PC, Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. The key marker that separates Max Payne 3 from its predecessors isn't the console generation it launched into. Instead, it's the game's developer. For whatever reason, Remedy wasn't tapped to develop Max Payne 3. Rockstar themselves opted to put the game together in-house, and it really shows. Tonally, the game is miles away from the first two entries. Instead of a morose and introspective Max driving himself forward with quiet purpose and resolute intent, we get a kind of a GTA version of the universe. It's one that features over-the-top characters breathlessly monologuing at a beaten-down Max that has completely lost his way in life. For a decent chunk of the game's campaign, Max sort of feels secondary to his own story, which I didn't really enjoy. Gameplay-wise, Rockstar have totally focused on the gun-fu element. This game is all about shooting men and doing it lots. You've far less agency in Max Payne 3 than you do in prior games. Most of the gameplay segments you play through are like little action vignettes, heavily bookended by cutscenes. Despite the flashy presentation, fresh locales, I never really felt like I was inhabiting an actual place in Max Payne 3. Look, I don't want to be too down on the game, as it does have its fans, and they're right to enjoy the game for what it does well. It just doesn't align with my tastes anywhere near as much as Max Payne 1 and Max Payne 2. Our first dip into Max Payne 3 comes courtesy of the PS3 version of the game, running via RPCS3 within SteamOS 3.5. Actually getting into the game proved to be a fruitless endeavour in this case, sadly. As per usual with RPCS3, we start things off with a lengthy SPU and PPU compilation step. Once that's finished, we find ourselves installing data within the game itself. That also takes ages, FYI. Once all that rubbish is taken care of, my expectations are actually exceeded for a moment. The game's opening cutscene renders correctly at a decently locked 30 FPS and with just one single audio crackle. Once that cutscene wraps, however, the game locks up and I'm forced to close out RPCS3 and attempt the whole process again. The furthest I was able to get in Max Payne 3 within RPCS3 was the game's main menu. I'd hardly call that a win in this case. RPCS3 as an emulator is a very demanding bit of software. Thanks to the Steam Deck's low thread count, it has a difficult time keeping pace with the emu's requirements. I'm not surprised Max Payne 3 doesn't work well, but I was at least hoping to see some actual gameplay for my troubles. The PS3 version of Max Payne 3 scores a very goofy 1 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. The next version of Max Payne 3 we're taking a look at is the Xbox 360 port running within Xenia-Canary. If you thought the PS3 port was a doozy to get running, then get a load of this. Thankfully, the game boots up at a much healthier pace. However, the issues stack up right from the get-go. The main menu fails to render any 3D visuals in the background, a surefire warning sign that things aren't going to go according to plan here. Once we begin the game, we go through the rather fiddly process of changing a disc within Xenia on deck. It is doable, but it's an absolute pain. Once we're actually in-game, we're treated to some audio, we also get the game's UI, and absolutely nothing else. It's into the void we go. You should be seeing some gaming here, but you aren't. Fiddling around with Xenia's config file netted zero benefits throughout my testing. The Xbox 360 version of the game is a bust. Max Payne 3 within Xenia-Canary scores a compatibility rating of 1 out of 10 on deck. Whilst we're on the subject of Max Payne 3 ports that don't work on deck, there was also a version of the game released for Mac OS over a year after its contemporaries. It seems like a pretty good conversion for all intents and purposes, however it's out of reach for us on Steam Deck. Mac games, not a chance. The Mac OS version of Max Payne 3 scores an earth-shattering 0 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. Our final pit stop has us coming face to face with the PC version of Max Payne 3, which is currently available for purchase on Steam. Whether or not you'll actually want to buy that version to play on your deck is up for debate, as Rockstar's proprietary game launcher has a habit of being updated and breaking compatibility with the Steam Deck. Despite owning the game on Steam, the version you're seeing me play here was secured via alternative means, and it works phenomenally on deck. I installed the game via Lutris, and it happily runs between 40 and 60 FPS on Valve's handheld at maximum settings. It's a gloriously fluid experience, and I'd argue that Max Payne 3's vignetted snapshots of gameplay are actually a really good fit for handheld play, in that you can dip in and out at your leisure. Thanks to Proton's effectiveness as a compatibility layer, Max Payne 3's PC port excels on Steam Deck, despite Rockstar's launcher making things unnecessarily difficult. Great visuals, excellent performance, and fluid controls result in the game scoring a 9 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. So that's every port of Max Payne 3 put through the gauntlet on Steam Deck. I'm relieved that there is at least one version of the game we can enjoy on deck, and that it performs so well on top of that. It's a clear and very obvious win for the PC in this particular instance. After 3 games and some 14 odd ports, we've touched upon every single port of every single Max Payne game on Steam Deck. It has truly been a joy to discover this series through making this video. Max Payne is a seminal franchise, and the second entry in particular will forever hold pride of place in my mind. It's a thoroughbred example of thoughtful writing and flawless game design. I love it. It was recently announced that both Max Payne 1 and 2 will be getting a remake courtesy of Remedy and their partnership with Rockstar, and that these remakes would be released as one single game. I'm not so sure how I feel about this. I think those original games hold up well, and even their old school elements have a certain charm that might be whittled away as the game is retuned for a modern audience. I can only hope that Remedy retain the player agency and sense of place that the first 2 games are so well known for. We'll have to wait and see. As for me, I'll be back with you very soon for something of a late Halloween special to cover a series that has been regularly requested by you fine folk. Camera at the ready. See ya.